Away from Bonnie, Scotland is Barry Gardiner, MP for Brent West. And he's with us because Emily Thornberry was to be, but she's had to pull out, unfortunately. We're very grateful to you, Barry, for stepping in. I think you are the Nigel Farage of Cross Question, in that he's been on Question Time, I think, more than anybody else, and I think you've been on Cross Question more times than anybody else. If you'd like to put a question to our panel, 0345 6060 973. You can, of course, watch us on Global Player. You can text us on 84850, and you can say, Alexa, send a comment to LBC, if that's the way you'd like to put your question to us.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
When I say there's so many subjects to ask about, there really is tonight. We've got the second assassination attempt on Donald Trump. We've got whether we should be sending more weapons to Ukraine that they could use inside Russia's borders. You've got what I'm calling clothing gate, the fact that Keir Starmer's wife has been in receipt of clothes which they haven't declared to the authorities, which I have to say I can't get too excited about that. But a lot of people are saying, well, it's just as if the Tories were back in power. Maybe a little unkind, but maybe you want to ask about those and indeed anything else. But let's go to our first caller. It's Jerry in St Albans. Hello, Jerry.
Hi, nice to have you back, by the way.
Thank you.
Now, basically, I've got a mental health issue, for example. Now, if I was to commit the same crime, would I be then treated in the same format as Mr. Hugh Edwards?
When you say the same format, are you referring to the fact that he was dealt with in a magistrate's court and it wasn't referred to the Crown Court, or are you referring to the sentence that he got?
Both, everything. So, I mean, it sounds like it's a little bit of a misdemeanor. You know, it's a magistrate's court, and, you know, that's all he got, 6 months suspended sentence. I would like to know, if I did exactly the same crime, or, you know, the man down the road did exactly the same crime, has the same health issues as he is saying, would we be dealt with in the same format?
Right. Barry Gardiner, let's come to you first. What's your view?
Well, look, the statue on the top of the Old Bailey is blindfolded, and justice is supposed to be blind with regard to the person. And I can't help thinking that in this case, the person has very much been taken into account. I think what's most disturbing is the message that this will send to so many people out there that this offence is not being treated with the seriousness that I believe that the public will look at it with.
Do you think it feeds into this idea that we've seen through the riots and subsequent to that a lot of people in the general public now believe that there is a sort of two-tier policing and a two-tier justice system? Because if too many people do start to believe that, that's a really slippery slope, isn't it?
Yes, it really is. And there should not be one rule for a celebrity and another rule for everybody else. So I have real sympathy with our caller tonight in her implication that she might be treated, or somebody else might be treated very differently who had committed this very, very serious crime.
Alison Phillips.
I think, Jerry, the reality of this is that actually if you did commit the exact same crime as Hugh Edwards, you probably would get the same sentence, because it's pretty... A lot of the legal people that have been speaking today are saying this is a pretty standard sentencing for this crime. Now, whether we think that's a sufficient sentence is obviously a completely different matter. I think lots of people would feel that it's not sufficient, but I think if we went and sat in a magistrate's court or even a Crown Court up and down the country at any point in the next few days or weeks, we would see lots and lots of things that we don't necessarily think are sufficient sentencing. I think one of the things that people were upset about when people were being released from prison earlier early 40% after 40% of their sentence rather than 50% last week, was I think people were genuinely shocked at how short a lot of those sentences were anyway. So I think that perhaps the issue is not so much that there's a special conditions for Hugh Edwards here, but they're just actually still a lot of the sentences that are being handed out aren't as long as people might think, and yet still our prisons are overcrowded.
Now, you were editing the Mirror when this story first emerged. There were accusations at the time that the media were treating Hugh Edwards differently to how they might treat anybody else. Do you think there's any substance in that?
I don't really. I mean, it was the Sun's investigation initially that brought this story, not this actual case that got to court. It was a different issue, but it was robustly investigated. And then I think the BBC, to be fair, did cover the story very well themselves. They didn't really try and hide from it. I think even now they carry on covering this story. They're not trying to run away from it. I think the big failing, perhaps, though, of the BBC is that they continue to pay Hugh Edwards after he was charged, even when some quite senior people knew the severity of the offences, and I think that has led to a bit of a breach of trust. But I think there's always a tendency now for people for this sort of whataboutery. A thing happens and everybody says, "Oh, but what about this? What about that? What about the other?" Obviously, every situation is different, but I do think in this situation, the sentencing and the treatment of Hugh Edwards has been pretty standard.
Steve Rigby.
I tend to agree with Alison. I think the broader point, though, is around custodial sentences more generally and where they're going. And I think the theme is frankly negative for justice, positive for the criminal. And I think we've got to be very careful. We're in a very tricky spot at the moment, which we need to be very careful around.
And is that because of the prison releases? Do you think that's all feeding into that?
You know, the prison release is a really complex issue. You know, one thing that's not really been debated much is the planning policy around prisons. And, you know, there are a number of prisons that have been put forward for construction, which are delayed in the planning process. So this issue's been around for a long time. I think the previous government was trying to tackle it. Clearly it's got to a chronic situation, and it's clearly now a situation where the present government are picking up a very difficult position.
Paul Scully.
Yeah, it's a really tricky situation. On my head agrees with what Alison was saying. My heart agrees with what Barry was saying, and so possibly it is about the overall sentencing rather than this particular case. Although I was listening to radio early on, LBC, you'll be pleased to know.
I'm delighted. I would expect nothing else.
And Tom Swarbrick was talking about the fact in his summing up, about when he was talking about the judges summing up, about Hugh Edwards' background, his difficult upbringing, but then the fact his mental health issue because he didn't go to Oxford University, which I was slightly perplexed about how that leads on to this kind of behaviour, stretching on from that.
I understand it from the point of view that being in the BBC, when he started at the BBC, I mean, I remember, because I'm about the same age as him, I applied for a job with the BBC when I left university, and I was up against 11 other people, all of whom had been to Oxford and Cambridge. Guess what? I hadn't. Guess who didn't get one of the jobs? I knew I'd done a brilliant interview.
Listen, I've had
9
years of hanging around with a load of old Etonians,
exactly.
And my father did pay a fortune for this accent, but nonetheless, that's independent school. But nonetheless, you know, there is always that sense of imposter syndrome when you're in Parliament with some of these guys. But that doesn't necessarily lead on to this sort of behaviour that we're tackling.
No,
I think in terms of the commentary that you were talking about with the BBC, there is often a case when the BBC tends to over compensate because of the sense of the accusations of bias, etc. So they have covered it quite comprehensively.
They like nothing more
than talking about the BBC.
They really do.
Yeah.
Whereas I think we would want to brush it all under the carpet. But do any of you have any sympathy, empathy with Hugh Edwards just on a basic human level?
I think he's a terribly damaged person, and I think when you listen to the mitigation there was today by a psychiatrist who said that he'd had this sort of quite domineering father, I think, and he'd grown up with a sense of shame about his sexuality. I think clearly he is vulnerable and damaged, and he is still suicidal. He's still an inpatient in a mental health facility. So he's...
In which case, why was he there today?
Well, I suppose you would have to turn up for sentencing, and that was the right thing to do because he had to get this done. So I think you can have absolute sort of sorrow this awful thing happened, and those poor children who would not have been abused were it not to make images that people like Hugh Edwards look at. So that is horrendous. But you can also sort of see the reasons why these things happen. It's not to excuse him, but it's to see that there are reasons why people offend in the way they do.
I have some sympathy for that, but there is always that, experts always talk about the manipulation of people that are involved in child abuse and paedophilia, etc., and portraying this reasoned person, whereas behind there is a sense of manipulation, a bit more malice. But I don't know, obviously, in this situation.
Yeah, but I think if we want these things to not happen, which as a society, obviously, we don't want them to happen, yes, we need to sentence people robustly, but we also need to understand why these things happen in the hope that we can try to avoid them.
Barry, I was shocked earlier when one of our guests told me that there are tens of thousands of similar cases to this in the justice system at the moment. I thought I must have misheard. I would have thought there might be hundreds, but not tens of thousands. And then he said that there was a report out recently that said there were 300,000 male paedophiles in this country, or at least. Now, this sort of sentence is not going to deter them, is it?
Well, look, if that's true, and I'm staggered by those figures, then how many children are being abused in order to satisfy their desires? That's what concerns me here. And, I understand what people are saying about the mental state of Hugh Edwards, but let's face it, lots of people grow up with difficult childhoods, and not all of them end up with the sort of wealth, fame, celebrity that Hugh Edwards ended up with. And, in many respects, you would say that he had a hugely successful life up until this point. So I'm not sure that I go along with the, oh, poor him argument.
I don't think anybody's sort of feeling sorry for him at this point. But, I think anybody who's had a friend who's been in a situation where they've been sent to prison for whatever the offence is will understand the conflicts that you have within yourself. We were talking about it earlier in the programme. That I had a friend who was convicted of something very similar to this. And I went to visit him in prison, and I'm sure there'll be many people listening who think I shouldn't have done that. But on a basic human level, you either are a friend and you stick by your friends in times of adversity, or you're not. And Hugh Edwards will certainly be finding out has found out who his friends are over the last few months and couple of years, I guess. Right, we'll move on to another subject. Jerry, thank you very much for your call. It's 8:15.
This is LBC. Leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale. Alexa, send a comment to LBC.
16 minutes past 8. On the panel with me, Barry Gardiner, the Labour MP for Brent West, outrageously not made a minister by Keir Starmer, Barry. That must have been a great shock to you.
I always say that it's up to the leader of the party to choose whoever he feels can best serve the country.
Do you regret those rows that you had with him in the shadow cabinet?
I didn't have rows. I try not to row with my colleagues. You know that, Ian. I'm a very courteous person. I respect my colleagues, and I try and give my reasoned arguments. Then,
But you didn't get on with him, did you? Let's put it that way.
Honestly, I do reject that. I got on with him as a human being perfectly well. I think there were issues that we disagreed on around Brexit, but that's politics.
Indeed. Steve Rigby, as a businessman, tell us about your various businesses.
So quite diverse, about 9,000 people across about 7 or so countries.
What's the wage bill for that every month?
It's pretty nasty. In technology and aviation and real estate. So really quite a diverse business, a top 10 family business in the UK.
Wow. Delighted to have you here.
Thank you
very much. Paul Scully and Alison Phillips, you both give me the air of two people who've been released from prison. You both seem to be much more sort of light and sort of enthusiastic without the burdens of office.
Alison was asking me as we were waiting to come in about how it was like, what it was like back to school. I said, no, because I'm back to business now, to startups and small business, and which is what I was doing before. And I'm saying I'm a semi-detached commentator with the emphasis on the detachment, because I'm clearly conservative at heart, but at least it's that sense of proportionality that you can have.
And who you're backing in the leadership contest?
I'm not backing anyone formally. I've always said at the beginning that I like the look of James Cleverly. No, I genuinely not. I think James Cleverly and Tom Tugendhat were coming into it with a kind of leadership people, sort of leadership first, ideology second, whereas Kemi and Rob feel more ideology first, leadership second. And so I think we've got to grasp the party. So James Cleverly was always a good friend of mine. He's been looking quite good in the hustings that I've seen, so I'd lean towards that at the moment.
Okay, well, so I'll settle for that. Alison, so what are you up to now?
I'm feeling very free, as you said. So I'm doing quite a bit of writing. I'm writing for New Statesman. I'm doing a bit of consultancy work. I'm sort of talking to lots of people about interesting things. And I think it's just quite interesting when you've been in a business. I was at the Mirror for 25 years, which I loved, but it was the right time for me, I think, to try some new things. But it is, you come out into the world and you just sort of see how many opportunities there are.
Right, let's go to our next question. It's a text question from Scott in West Hampstead. Should the UK give Ukraine permission to use Storm Shadow missiles within Russia, or should Keir Starmer bide his time and await the outcome of the US presidential election? Now, as a bit of background to this, Ukraine has not yet been given permission to use these British-donated missiles against targets in Russia, despite Keir Starmer's meeting with Joe Biden in the White House on Friday. The Biden administration has been clear that the different missiles provided to Ukraine by the US military will definitely not be allowed to use in Russia. Paul, let's start with you.
Yeah, I think Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, was saying that NATO members should have their own views on that and be able to make their own decisions.
You were saying that to Andrew Marler earlier.
Exactly. Quite the LBC theme continues.
3 programmes in a row. You're glutton for punishment.
And it's... and I think that's absolutely right, because the problem is, there's a number of problems. If you wait for the US elections, you're into the winter in Ukraine and Russia, and it's always a hard winter in those areas as well. And whereas Ukraine have been making some inroads in their encroaching into their attacks into Russian territory, that is, I think, helping their cause and putting Putin on the back foot. But there is always also the risk with delay of sort of war fatigue in the West. Because, we've had any number of conflicts over the last few years. People barely remember Syria. They barely remember Afghanistan. They certainly don't remember the Rohingya exodus in Burma, in Bangladesh a few years ago. And so what you can't do is take off your foot off the pedal in Ukraine at the moment, because then what that does, that gives the signal to someone like China to then look at the time lag between that war fatigue with the risk of Taiwan, for example, and places like that. We have to stamp down quickly.
You see, if we don't allow these weapons to be used, doesn't that send a signal of weakness to Putin? And that's the problem here. I mean, I've just got a book on dictators out at the moment, and the lesson from that book, where we've written about 64 throughout history, is if you don't stand up to dictators, well, they will go and do it over and over again. And obviously, if we do allow this to happen, there is a risk that Putin could respond in a way, maybe an unpredictable way. Steve Rigby.
I think we have to be personally very careful with the allies that we have. I think we are a nation today that relies on our own protection through allies. That we can debate whether the spend on our military should increase, but separately we rely on our allies, and that's something that's going to happen moving forward. We are in an alliance, and I think moving as a single party is an important step. Yes, we have to face a very difficult dictator in Putin, but ultimately, certainly with America, I think being lockstep is very important.
Barry?
Yeah, I understand that these missiles cannot be operated unless British service personnel are steering them, guiding them, and operating them. And what I'm afraid of is that if that is the case, and I'm led to believe it is, then it would mean that British personnel were involved in an attack on Russia if those missiles were allowed to be used in that way. So I do think it's a very dangerous step. I totally understand what you said, Iain, about standing up to dictators, and I think it's right that we continue to assist Ukraine as much as we can. But I do think that if we were to engage our personnel in an attack that went into Russia in that way, that would be a very different trigger point. And what Steve says about it being potential for Putin to respond in ways that might be extremely ugly, then I think we need to be very careful here before we move out of line with our partners in NATO.
And in addition to that, Putin has already made clear that we are his least favourite country. So if there was going to be some sort of retaliation, we would probably cop it before any other European country. Now, I suppose the question then follows, well, what form would that retaliation be? And that must be what everybody in the MOD and the Foreign Office are debating at the moment.
Absolutely. I mean, it is complicated. It's very easy to say in a radio studio one way or t'other. You have to do this incredibly carefully with all of the facts and all of the intelligence behind you. But we also do need to be. We shouldn't shirk from our responsibilities. I think that's all I'm saying. I think in this, because otherwise it will fuel other areas, other regions, other leaders, and clearly other dictators.
Well, just on that, we've got Grant Shapps, the former Defence Secretary. He's coming to the studio tomorrow at 7. He'll be here for the whole hour taking calls. So if you've got questions on the different scenarios that we're talking about him, do make sure you listen to that hour. Maybe phone in tomorrow. Right, let's move on. We have Martin in Doncaster.
Iain.
Martin, good to have you on the show again.
Hi, Iain. Yeah, my question is after 14 years of Tory sleaze, why is Keir Starmer just carrying the baton on? Because I'm a lifelong Labour voter, and I won't vote Labour again, and that's only after 70 days. 1, because the passes, and 2, because of the winter fuel payments. I think it's just and that's after 70 days. I feel disgusting, mate.
Well, you can disagree with the winter fuel payments, but that is not an example of sleaze of any. I mean, you might say, well, they're hypocrites in what they said during the election, but I think you've got to separate the policies out from maybe some of the alleged misdemeanours. When you look at this, Steve, sort of coming from outside, do you sort of just shrug your shoulders and think, well, this is just what happens in politics, or do you think that there is intrinsically something wrong with our politics, that politicians, small parties, just don't see the wood from the trees in terms of doing the right thing?
I think we've got to cut these guys a little bit of slack. Personally, they're very, very new in the role. I'm sure there are mistakes that have been made as we go along, but the country needs hope, and we're very quick to talk ourselves down. And at this moment in time,
well, the Prime Minister keeps talking us down, doesn't he?
I mean, I agree with you. I think that's a real shame. But a pro-growth, pro-business agenda, trying to change the economy for the better of all of the country, that's got to be in our interests. And I hope post the budget in 6 weeks' time, we can get back to that pro-growth, pro-business agenda.
But what effect does it have on you as a business when the Prime Minister makes a speech that is full of doom and gloom, no sign of sort of, well, we're heading to the sunlit uplands and this is how we're going to get there, but we're in a terrible state, blah, blah, blah. It's all the fault of the wicked Tories and we're going to have to introduce some sort of very bad measures. Does that make you think, I'm not sure I'm going to invest as much money as I was going to. I just want to see how things develop, because that's the message I'm getting from business, both small and large. We're putting a lot of investments on hold.
I think the next few weeks are pretty key, and I think taking brave decisions right now would be a very brave thing to do. So I think, the important thing is post the budget, we've got to get a positive momentum back. One bad speech in a garden, which was staged clearly for its purpose, is one thing, but the overall sentiment's got to move towards a positive sentiment. And I was very hopeful, having met, Rachel and Johnny Reynolds prior to the election. They're very pro business. They're very pro growth, and I just hope that sentiment continues, because it will get the country out of where we are right now.
Barry Gardiner.
Yeah, look, I welcome what Steve said. We do need to get the country out of the mess it's in. Coming back to the question about sleaze, though, that our listener put, my understanding is that Keir Starmer did actually record properly in the register his own gifts and of glasses and whatever. It was his wife's dresser clothes that were not. So I don't know why that was the case. It may have been an oversight, but clearly I think on the part of the Prime Minister, there was no intention to deceive about what he had received. It was there declared. On the wider issue around business...
Just on that, Barry, can you explain to our listeners why a family that has an income in excess of £200,000 a year needs to have clothes or glasses bought for them?
No, I can't.
No, and I think that is where people look and think, well, it's like Animal Farm. Yeah. They looked from left to right, they looked from beast to beast, and they all seemed to be the same. I mean, that's the problem that they've got after only 2 months in office.
I mean, I can imagine that when people are busy and somebody says, "Oh, I'll arrange a dresser to go and get some clothes for you," I can imagine that somebody said, "Oh, thanks, that's really great," but you have to understand that it can't be a gift. It can't be a gift. The optics are bad. I accept that. But on the issue of the mood and getting the economy going again, I think it is important that government shows that it's trying to play straight with people and it's not trying to hide bad news. Now, before the election, we know that there was a problem in this year's current account, £21.9 billion that was simply not funded by the previous government. We can't pretend that doesn't exist, and we have to show that we're dealing with it properly and trying to get the economy back on track. But the key thing here is how we grow the economy, and that is why I've always said we need to actually show that we can borrow for investment, but never for consumption.
Okay.
I think that's the thing that business will understand.
Okay, I'm going to come to Paul and Alison after the news. So let's get the news from Daryl Jackson on LBC. It's 8:30.
Junior doctors have voted to accept an average pay rise of 22.3% over 2 years. The British Medical Association says 2/3 of medics voted in favour. Hugh Edwards' lawyer says he's truly sorry after being handed a suspended sentence for accessing indecent images of children. The former BBC News presenter admitted possessing dozens of pictures sent to him by a convicted paedophile. And the Met Office says the Northern Lights may be visible over parts of the UK tonight and early tomorrow morning. They're most likely to be seen in Scotland, Northern Ireland and northern areas of England and Wales. LBC weather clear and dry for much of the UK tonight. A few light spells of rain in the Northern Isles and a low of 4 degrees.
This is LBC. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
8:33 with me on Cross Question. Alison Phillips, former Mirror editor. Paul Scully, former Conservative MP and Minister. The businessman Steve Rigby and Barry Gardiner, Labour MP for Brent West. Now, we were just talking about this question from Martin in Doncaster, who, let me sum up his question, after 14 years of Tory sleaze, why is Keir Starmer just carrying the baton forward? As a lifetime Labour voter, I don't think I'll ever vote for them again. Now, I want to transport you back to your Mirror days now. If you were still editing the Mirror, how would you be covering this?
We would have been very cross. And I feel...
Down with that sort of stuff.
Yeah, we're not big on this kind of thing. And I feel genuinely sad that Martin feels that, because we've waited 14 years. We went through all those awful cases over the last few years where we had Boris Johnson, his wallpaper... just this idea that he would go from breaking one rule to another rule. Rules didn't apply to him or anybody around him. And then finally, Keir Starmer comes in on this project of being clean and doing service. And I honestly believe that is what he is about. And then this seems to have happened. I mean, to be absolutely fair, though, the reason we know about it is because Starmer's office went back and said, oh, we think there's a few things that we should have told you about that we've been given that we didn't tell you about. So that's how we know about it. It hasn't been sort of dragged out of them by some investigation. So I think they were genuinely trying to be honest. But I think probably coming back to the original question, I think people on a salary of £200,000 a year should buy their own clothes. And I think... as a society, we should all be happy to see Mrs. Starmer wearing an outfit Lady Starmer wearing an outfit from Marks and Spencer's again and again and again. And if everyone's happy not to criticise her, then that's how it's going to have to be. Like, ordinary people wear their clothes over and over again.
Because we kind of want it both ways, don't we? We don't want public money to be spent on effectively First Lady's clothes. But on the other hand, we want her to look good when she goes on and she does look. I mean, I've never seen her not look good.
She looks fabulous, and I feel sort of really sorry for her, because I think she doesn't want the spotlight, but there are events that she has to turn up to because she's married to him. She's continuing to do her job, and now she has found herself in the middle of this storm, and I think it was a genuine mistake that at the first opportunity they attempted to rectify.
Paul Scully, as a man of sartorial elegance yourself, what's your view?
This is my sartorial elegance for radio. I agree with Steve that being pro-growth and growing the economy is absolutely paramount. It's what we've all got to get behind, even if we disagree on the methods of doing so. But the problem is, with any politician, when you're doing that, and then the focus comes on, not on pro-growth, not on encouraging investment, but talking about, what did you call it? You call it clothing gate. Like, we've got to get or Frocky Horror Show, as I heard it called the other day. It's, people are focusing on this. And I think where the Conservatives have come from on this, in their attacks as opposition, is the hypocrisy, really. Is yes, it may have been a mistake. I'm still not sure how you can make a mistake when, if you're gifted something, you've got to register it, whether it's you or your partner or connected parties, etc. That's just standard par for the course. But it's this idea that, we've had it thrown at us over the last year, and I know there were lots of mistakes in the last in the last government. I'm not going to defend that at all. But just the fact is that you must resign. Before you even investigated, you've got to step down. You've got to do this. And then this stuff happens, and oh no, it's okay because it's us. Because Tories can do no good, Labour can do no bad. That's what it feels like at sometimes.
And I just think that Labour just need to be better than the Tories in the past. They just need to show that they're better and they've got a higher moral standard. And that's why it is disappointing.
And the Labour Party won the election on that basis. They won the election, and that's why I was talking about earlier about gripping our party, the Conservative Party, because we just weren't good enough. The perception of our competence was just not there. I will leave others to judge the actual competence. But the Labour Party need to come in and actually, as you say, do what they said they were going to do.
But Barry, this all feeds into Carol Vorderman's thesis that basically our political classes are by and large corrupt to one degree or another. And we talked about this on the podcast that I did with her last Thursday, and I was trying to convince her that it's just not the case. but she was having none of it. And it's a very easy thing to believe, isn't it? That sort of, well, they're all as bad as each other. They're all the same. They're all on the take. They all want to get out of it what they can personally get out of it. And I can bleat on as much as I like about, well, virtually every politician I know does not take that point of view. They're not in it for personal gain. But things like this just feed into that narrative, don't they? Barry, I was aiming that at you.
Sorry, you froze for a minute, so I didn't. That's the problems of connecting by Zoom, I'm afraid. Yeah, look, you're right. Most of the people that I know, and I'm talking cross-party, I'm not talking, in any one party. Most of the people that I know in Parliament actually are there to do a good job and to serve the public. So it doesn't help when things like this happen. But I do think, we just have to, as Paul said, we have to present ourselves, somebody else said, we have to present ourselves as better than what went before. And I think it is important that this was something that went wrong and it was corrected. But the fundamental issue is, should it have been accepted as a gift in the first place? And I suspect the answer to that is it would have been better if it hadn't.
I mean, in terms of the gift, actually, I don't think there's anything wrong with it, apart from the fact it doesn't pass the sniff test, as you say, because someone earning over £200,000 as a household income, totally agree with that. In terms of how we are as politicians, and as I was as a politician, keep forgetting, we do it by the vast majority for public service. Someone said to me really early on, before I'd even got elected, if you want to end up with a small fortune in politics, you've got to start with a large one. You certainly don't do it for the money.
Nick on a text says, does the panel think that Iain should get a clothing allowance from LBC, given that he's looking a bit scruffy tonight, cheeky blighter? I'll tell you what, I haven't been able to fit into this suit for 5 years.
Wow.
So, I think it's a rather nice suit. But anyway, if you're listening on the radio, it won't mean anything to you. Brian in Portsmouth says, should the government be congratulated for getting the junior doctors to vote to end their strikes, or condemned for giving them such a huge pay rise as a reward for their walkouts? Now, 2/3 of junior doctors in England who are members of the BMA have voted in favour of the government's offer of a 22% pay rise over 2 years. Those junior doctors have taken part in 11 separate strikes over the course of 18 months. Steve Rigby, let's come to you first.
I think there's a dangerous precedent for sure at 22%. It's an unsustainable rise, but I think this issue's been left far too long. And I think, I welcome the comments from Darcy in the course of the last week around reforming rather than just continual funding for NHS. I think that's really very essential. The productivity fall of 17% is scary in an organisation, a public company. You couldn't do that. You would be under too much scrutiny.
So they're being rewarded for failure, basically.
I don't think we can blame junior doctors for that who are working 70 or 80 hours a week. I'm not sure how many we all know collectively, but you never meet one that isn't working very hard. So I don't think it's their fault. But the process that we've got ourselves into around pay rises isn't sustainable. And I think, I really welcome productivity changes as a way forward, albeit, this is a 10-year journey ahead.
Well, I have to say, when I was in hospital, I didn't meet a single junior doctor who wanted to continue the strikes. Paul Scully.
Yeah, well, and I can understand that. I mean, there has felt at times at the top of the BMA that it's felt a little bit politicised. But I agree with what Steve was saying about broader strikes as well. I'm not sure about junior doctors, but the broader strike background, that there does need to be productivity reforms and gains within any settlement. And as you rightly say, 22% is unsustainable. Because what we've seen with the NHS in particular, we've seen funding going up in real terms, to a record amount in real terms, gone up 20%. We have not seen productivity go up. We've seen it fall. Now, that's, I think, if you strip out the effect of COVID, because COVID has had a massive effect, which is still unwinding.
So why is it that in all of these pay settlements, whether it's with the train drivers, the public sector workers, teachers, and also NHS, they're all no strings attached?
This is what I find extraordinary, because I think it's just, here's a problem, let's just make it go away, which will come back to bite the government and certainly us as taxpayers down the line. I think this is what, when we talk about pro-growth, when we're talking about, restoring confidence in the government and restoring our public services, you've got to do it carefully. You can't just sort of like launch in to get a good headline now. You've got to sometimes, have a decent strategy. I think the Labour Party came in, they had 6 months to prepare, probably around 6 months to prepare for those first few days, and they did the appointments fine and all those kind of things. I think they start to lose their way relatively quickly because they weren't ready for the job.
Barry is chomping at the bit, I can see.
I am. Look, £32,398. That's the starting point for a junior doctor. And I think if you just understand all that a doctor has to do, all the education and training that a doctor has to do to get to that starting point, and then you understand that even after this pay rise, even after it, they will be earning in real terms 21% less than they were in 2008. So this idea that this is money for old rope and surely we should have had productivity increases, the fact is we've had a huge productivity increase in real terms because they're earning a fifth less after this pay rise than they were 16 years ago. Now, I think the junior doctors had every right to call out what was happening in their profession, because they work their butts off, and what happens is they burn out, they leave the profession, and it's the NHS that suffers. So thank goodness we've got a government that's addressing the crisis in our NHS, but saying, let's pay these people properly and let's get the NHS back on its feet. Let's reduce the 7.8 million on the waiting list, and put people off the waiting list and back into productive employment in the economy. That makes perfect economic sense.
Well, I don't begrudge junior doctors a fair salary at all. Let me just give one observation before I come to you, Alison. When I was in hospital, I was in intensive care for several days, and then I was moved on to a ward, and my bed was opposite the nurses' station. So I got to see what happened. It was actually a really interesting experience. And there was one nurse who was a slightly older lady who basically made the whole thing work. She wasn't a matron. She was a grade 2 care support worker. And I talked to her about what she did and her job and all the rest of it, and she loved her job. But she basically told me that, well, it's the grade 2 in my grade and the grade 5s that run this place. You could get rid of all of the grade 8s and no one would notice. And as if by magic, then a nurse dressed in a sort of purple uniform, looking sort of as if she hadn't done a day's work in her life, turned up and said to the nurse's station, "Everything okay? Jolly good, jolly good," and then went away again. I said, well, who is she? She said, we have no idea, but she comes in every day and that's all she ever says. And she then told me she's just a few pence above minimum wage. And this is somebody who has a huge responsibility. And I thought that is where Streeting, who will be here on Wednesday, by the way, that is where he needs to really make some changes. End of rant, Alison.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And the junior doctors, this 22%, this is because we, as Barry was saying, we've had years and years of below inflation increases. When Labour got into power, the country was stuck. It was entirely stuck. And in the NHS, we were really stuck. No way to move forward until we could actually get things back onto an even keel. And I think by giving this pay rise, by restoring relations with the doctors, then it gives the green light to all the reforms that are required if we're really going to make the differences that we need. And things like the nurse that you spoke about, she's exactly the sort of person that needs to feel valued within that role, which is so important. And then you would hope that a proper reform of the NHS will weed out all those people, the bureaucrats and the pen pushers, who aren't really contributing what we need. And then we can also look at the reform we need with digitalisation and with AI AI that means that really the focus can be on the caregivers on the front line, and a lot of that other stuff becomes automated, and we can actually have an NHS that sort of feels ready for this century.
I think the BMA is already pushing back, though, aren't they, on more nursing powers?
Well, I do wonder, though, that now that this element is resolved as well, that there can be like a sort of negotiations in good faith, because I think that was what was lacking so much.
Two quick points. I wouldn't get rid of all of the bureaucrats and pen pushers, because it's something that we chased years and years ago. And the problem is, you want the nurses to nurse, you want the doctors to do their thing as well. And in terms of nursing, we've made it a graduate profession as well, which actually wants people to leap towards those grade 8s rather than the caring profession that we started.
We are running late and we've got a lot more still to come. So let's go to a break. And during the break, I will be telling our panel what the fun question at the end is, just so they can come up with really, really, really hilarious answers.
Sure.
It's 8:48, no pressure.
This is LBC. Terms apply. Cross Question with Iain Dale on LBC.
Alison, Phillips, Paul Scully, Steve Rigby and Barry Gardiner with us answering your questions. The next one is from Billy in Ventnor on the Isle of Wight. Very glad you've stayed with the programme in my absence, Billy.
Well, it's the first time I've rang in for 7 weeks, Ian, and it's lovely to hear you back on the show with your panel.
Well, thank you. What would you like to ask?
So my question relates to the way people express their political views. Where do we draw the line? Of course, Donald Trump now having his life threatened twice, people camping outside Keir Starmer's house just a year ago, Nigel Farage having a milkshake thrown at him. I mean, the list goes on. And, of course, let's not forget the amount of abuse that Diane Abbott has to put up with on a weekly basis. So where is the line drawn and what do we do about it, panel?
Alison Phillips.
I think people have got the right to have the right to express their opinion, but people have got to do it in a legal way, and I think people should try to do it in a considerate way. I think some of the things you say about the way that the abuse that Diane Abbott and other women MPs and politicians of colour have really come under attack is deeply, deeply unpleasant. And I think people have got to start taking far greater consideration over the impact of their words. And I think on social media we see it all the time, where people write things that we would never in a million years be able to publish in a newspaper, because there is all the rules and laws around what you can and cannot write. And I think as a society, people need to start taking a lot more responsibility for the words that they use, but within the knowledge that free speech and free expression is a huge part of being human.
Paul?
So I was the tech minister that finished off the online safety bill, and I hope the Labour Party really speed up, do everything they can to get that operational through. There's a lot of work that needs to be done through Ofcom, rather than trying to unpick some of the stuff, because what we did do in protecting freedom of speech, we scrapped the proposals that we had earlier on about being legal but harmful, when that really does impinges on freedom of speech. But essentially what we're trying to do, apart from making sure that children were safe, having a child protection bill, we're trying to say that make it easy and make it required that the Twitter, Facebook, etc., adhere to their own terms and conditions. Because actually the description, the things you were saying about Diane Abbott, etc., if it's racist, if it's hate crimes and these kind of things, they are illegal. If they're not illegal, they are against the terms and conditions of most of these companies' rules.
But they're not against the terms and conditions of the Conservative Party, which has accepted £5 million in donations from Frank Hester, who admitted that he made racist comments, and yet the party was willing to do that. I mean, surely the Conservative Party should be setting an example.
Well, I think but you can talk about the example, but I mean, what they're not doing, I don't think you can conflate the two in terms of exactly. But I'm not sure I can stick. But I mean, in terms of what they're doing, because you also do have to give people a second chance. And I don't know really what Frank Hester has said. I never met the guy. What he said about subsequently, if he's repentant or if he thought that was stupid, which of course it is, what he was reported to have said. But nonetheless, you have to get that online safety bill operational now. But then what Alison was talking about, education, there's a load of education going into young kids. So the next generation, I think, will be better off. But it's what we do with our age.
Barry Gardiner.
I think Alison had this sort of the nub of this, because it's the point at which speech becomes active, becomes action. And the word here is incitement. So when speech begins to incite people to do things that are criminal or against the law or are then going to harm other people, so incitement to hatred is something that is illegal. And there's a very fine line here between saying something which in and of itself is hateful, which is legal, and something which is both hateful and encourages other people to then express that hatred in a physical way.
Steve?
I think generally we have to be careful of divisive politics. And it's fueling much of this sentiment. So clearly we've got the march of the far right now, in France, in Germany, in the Netherlands, in Italy, clearly the UK much further behind that, fortunately. But divisive politics, I think is at the heart of the issues that we face here. And, to have a public officer threatened in any way is appalling. And it will lead towards some form of protection if we're not careful.
Thank you to everyone who's saying how much they enjoy Cross Question. Good to have you back. Cross Question is a daily highlight for me. It shines a light on the Labour hypocrisy. I'm not sure that's what it's meant for, but hey, we'll take anything. And thanks for all of the comments on the NHS following our discussion earlier on. And just to repeat, Wes Streeting will be with me from 7 on Wednesday, and he'll be taking your calls as well. Now, a text question here from Lisa in Bristol. Will Keir Starmer face the same backlash for a potential Albania deal as Rishi Sunak got for his Rwanda plan? Barry Gardiner.
Look, for a long time, there's been returning of asylum seekers to Albania who are from Albania. As I understand it, what's being proposed is not the same as the Rwanda plan. It's not saying anybody who comes here on a small boat and who under the law now is deemed to be illegal is then deported to a particular country. It's saying that this will be a staging post, Albania will be the staging post wherein those asylum claims can be properly determined. So it will then provide a safe and legal route for people to come to the UK. That's a very different thing. So this is actually about the processing of asylum claims, not about putting people to a country and saying that they have no right to come here, and therefore we're going to be deporting them to another country.
Paul, that is correct. It's not quite the same as the Rwanda scheme. The only similarity is it's offshoring the process. Yeah. But the Italian scheme is people can then, if they get through the system, then go and live in Italy. So is it fair to compare the two?
Well, I think it is, but it is different, clearly. And the strict answer to your question about will he have any pushback, no, he won't, because it's been from his side that actually has been kicking up. And at least it is something. It's not the deterrent that the Rwanda plan was, but it is something. What he's also talked about is smashing the gangs and these kind of things, but with no detail yet of how he's going to do that. We've had the Serious Organised Crime Unit agency. We've had the National Crime Agency trying to smash the gangs since at least 2006. What is going to change now? You've got to change the model. Alison,
I mean, if the Conservatives had proposed this in Albania, I suspect the then Labour opposition would have been vehemently against it.
I'm not sure. I mean, it is very, very different to Rwanda. So the people that were processed in this way would still have the opportunity to apply for asylum in the United Kingdom. I mean, there's all sorts of things I think that were interesting that he was looking at in Italy as well on his trip, beyond just the Albania scheme, which I think was quite interesting about how, I mean, Italy have done this extraordinary job of reducing illegal immigration by something like 65%. Yeah. It's huge. And a lot of that is about stopping people from leaving North Africa in the first place. And I think that's the kind of thing that if the government is looking at is going to be very interesting in actually upstream, stopping the people from leaving in the first instance. And I think that is a really good plan.
Steve?
Aside from immigration, we did secure £450 million of investment today from Leonardo, so I think the trip was worthwhile.
Good stuff. Admirably concise. Right, let's go to our fun question from Olivia in Manchester. A rare species of yellow-eyed penguin has won the annual Bird of the Year competition in New Zealand. Which species of animal do you want to give greater recognition to, and why? Barry? Oh no, actually, that's unfair because I don't think you heard me in the break because you couldn't hear us then. So I'll come to you last, Paul.
I don't know about species, but my dog Fred, my fox red Labrador, because he's his school dog. My other half's a head teacher, and he was in school for the first time today. And there were some tearful children that were had their salved by the attention, the love and attention of my lovely dog.
Oh, what a heartwarming story, Alison.
Very differently. I was going to go with porcupine, which I wondered if every house was to have a porcupine, and then every time you had sort of annoying people that turn up or wanted to come to the door and ask you annoying things, you'd send the porcupine out and scare them off.
That's an original answer. Steve, compete with that?
Difficult. I'm going to stick on the penguins. I'm going to see some emperor penguins later this year, so I'm going to say emperor penguins.
Okay.
Very good.
Barry?
I'm going to say beetles for two reasons. One is that they are huge pollinators, and goodness knows we need pollinators. And the other is, if I'm allowed to say this on the programme, they eat shit. And we need...
It's 1 minute past 9. You can just about get away with it. But apologies to anyone offended by Barry's potty mouth.
We need to break down these things, and they do it admirably for us. So they contribute hugely to our ecosystem in many, many ways.
Send them to Thames Water.
As do you, Barry. But you did cause the gallery to gasp in horror at your potty mouth. Thank you very much indeed. Thanks for stepping in at the last minute, Barry. Paul Scully, Alison Phillips, Steve Rigby, thank you to you. And tomorrow on the panel, we'll have the new Labour peer and former MP, Baroness Margaret Hodge, former Conservative MP and Cabinet Minister, Theresa Villas, the broadcaster and lots of formers here, former advisor to Boris Johnson, Gito Harry, and the Labour activist Chavan Owusu-Nepal, who you might remember as the very stylishly dressed Labour candidate who was up against Nigel Farage in Clacton at the election. Let's